The first time I went down into the trench, I saw something that didn't belong to this world. Pale hands brushing against the glass of my helmet from the outside, far below where no human should exist. That was when they gave me the 11 rules. At first I laughed, thinking they were nothing more than old diver superstitions. But then I broke one. I remember the moment vividly, the way the ocean seemed to breathe around me, pulling me deeper, as if it wanted me. Each dive since has been a fight to remember the rules and to survive them. I'll start with the first, but I need you to understand. Once you hear it, you'll realize why I never dive alone. The first time I heard the warning, it came from an old diver named Alvarez. He leaned against the railing of the ship, his face leathery from years of salt and sun, and told me, "The ocean chooses when it allows us in. Rule 1, never descend before the ocean is ready." I laughed at the time, thinking it was just the kind of cryptic nonsense old men like to pass on to scare rookies. But his eyes didn't match the joke. They were flat, steady, and utterly serious, as though he'd seen something I couldn't begin to imagine. The day was clear, the water deceptively calm, and the captain had already been pacing in frustration. Sponsors demanded progress, and time wasted meant money burned. Everything about the scene told me we should already be descending. Yet Alvarez shook his head and muttered that it wasn't the right moment. He kept staring at the water as if reading some invisible language written in the tides. The others mocked him lightly, but nobody dared step out of line. There was a weight in his words that even mockery couldn't mask. I remember standing at the edge, gear strapped and ready, watching the surface ripple in strange, unnatural rhythms. The waves didn't break as they should. Instead, they swelled and stilled like the ocean was breathing. Alvarez told me to wait, his tone more commanding than the captain's. The delay stretched for hours, the crew restless, but something in me agreed with him. My nerves tingled, as though the water itself pressed against my skin even while I stood safely on deck. It was the first time I began to think the sea was more than just a body of water. When Alvarez finally nodded and said it was time, relief spread across the group like a silent current. The descent that day went smoothly, the trench swallowing us in darkness, but nothing unnatural followed. Yet I couldn't forget the sense of invisible permission that lingered, as though the ocean had decided we were allowed. The thought should have felt absurd, but it didn't. It felt like truth, and later, when Alvarez wasn't there to guide us, I would learn just how costly it was to ignore the waiting. Weeks later, the chance came. Alvarez was bedridden from illness, and the captain insisted we dive regardless. The morning had that same stillness, that breathless hush over the waves, but this time no one said to wait. I hesitated, remembering the sternness in Alvarez's voice, but orders are orders. We descended. At first, everything felt normal, the usual chill, the gradual dimming of light, the creak of pressure around the suit. But then I realized something was wrong. The water pressed harder, more suffocating than usual, and the darkness felt heavier, thicker, like oil rather than seawater. Shapes began to move where nothing should have. At 100 feet, I caught sight of the first one, a flicker, sliding just out of my light. Too smooth, too deliberate, not like fish darting, but like predators circling. The comms filled with nervous breathing, no one daring to speak what we all saw. The current grew erratic, tugging us sideways, dragging us downward in pulses. My chest tightened, as though unseen eyes were fixed on us, and the memory of Alvarez's warning roared in my skull. The ocean hadn't been ready, and now it wanted us gone. By 200 feet, whispers leaked into my helmet, faint vibrations that crawled into my ears. I thought it was static, until words began to form, half-heard syllables, broken fragments of my own name. I jerked my head, scanning the water, and that's when I saw it. A pale face drifting just beyond the beam of my lamp, impossibly human yet utterly wrong. Its mouth moved silently, stretching too wide, the jaw unhinging like a snake's. Hollow sockets locked onto me, black and endless. My blood froze, and my grip tightened on the tether line. The others saw them too, I heard one diver's breathing turn ragged as he whispered a prayer. Another stammered about turning back, but the captain ordered us to push forward. That was the moment one of the shadows shot upward past my shoulder, brushing my arm with something cold and slick. My scream stuck in my throat. The captain shouted for focus, but I knew the dive was already lost. We weren't supposed to be there, and something wanted to make that clear. The trench wasn't just deep, it was aware. We aborted quickly, abandoning the mission halfway down. As soon as my helmet broke the surface, I ripped it off and gasped for air, heart hammering like I'd run for miles. No one spoke about what we'd seen, though our silence was answer enough. Back on deck, I noticed something wrong with my suit. Water dripped from it, but not the clear salt water I knew. This was darker, murky, streaked with black. When I lifted the helmet, 5 thin marks dragged downward across the visor like claw scratches. They hadn't been there before. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face hovering in the deep, its jaw moving in soundless words. I woke drenched in sweat, or so I thought, but when I touched the sheets, they were cold, damp with brine, smelling of rot. My radio crackled faintly on the nightstand, though it was turned off, a low hiss that pulsed like breathing. I lay frozen in my bunk, staring into the dark, until dawn finally broke and drove the whispers away. The others slept undisturbed, but I knew the ocean had followed me back. I tried confronting the captain the next day. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed something else, fear. "You weren't supposed to dive without him," he admitted quietly, meaning Alvarez. "That's why the rule exists." He explained that the trench isn't simply a place, but a presence. It allows entry, or it doesn't. And if you force your way in, you draw attention. Sometimes that attention is harmless, sometimes it marks you, and sometimes it doesn't let go. He didn't need to say which one applied to me. I already knew. From that point, I began watching for the signs Alvarez once described: birds that refused to circle, currents that seemed to pause, the unnatural stillness of waves. I tested the air, felt the winds, studied the horizon for shifts no instrument could record. More than once, we postponed dives because the sea itself felt wrong, and each time we waited, nothing came for us. But the times we didn't, when schedules overruled instincts, the shadows returned. Each violation grew worse, as though the ocean remembered and punished us more fiercely with every trespass. One diver, Thomas, nearly drowned when his tether twisted around his leg, pulled by something unseen. Another swore he heard his dead wife, calling him through the comms, coaxing him deeper. A third simply vanished in the gloom. His line cut clean, his body never recovered. Each incident stained the crew's silence darker, until none of us laughed at Alvarez's warnings again. We didn't speak of it aloud, but every man knew the first rule was not optional. It was the only thing keeping us from being consumed. My last proof came on shore leave. Weeks later, walking the docks at night, I noticed wet footprints leading ahead of me. I followed them instinctively, each step soaking into the wooden boards. They stopped abruptly at the pier's edge, vanishing into nothing. When I peered into the water, my breath caught. The pale face was there, drifting just beneath the surface, staring up, lips moving in silent shapes. It didn't blink, it didn't fade, it waited. I stumbled back, heart thundering, and when I looked again, the water was empty. But I knew it had seen me. Alvarez once told me something I never forgot. The ocean remembers. Now I understand what he meant. Breaking the first rule wasn't a mistake of timing, it was an act of defiance, and the ocean does not forgive defiance. To this day, when I stand on the deck and feel that unnatural stillness settle over the waves, I refuse to descend, because I know if I do, the pale faces will be waiting, whispering my name, and this time they won't let me come back. I remembered Alvarez's warnings as I strapped back into my suit for the second descent. The laminated sheet in my hand bore Rule 2. Never turn off your light once you're below. and I felt a shiver that ran colder than the trench water. The last dive had left shadows etched into my memory, pale faces that stared without blinking, moving with a purpose I could barely comprehend. Turning off my light had never been an option in my mind, yet now the rule seemed like a fragile line between survival and being swallowed entirely. I doubted I could follow it and remain sane. The crew was silent as we descended. The surface had the same deceptive stillness, the waves holding their breath as if watching us. Each flicker of my lamp carved through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the water but revealing nothing solid. Yet I could sense shapes lurking just beyond reach. I tried to focus on the instruments, on the numerical safety of depth and pressure, but the shadows moved too deliberately, flitting around the edges of visibility. Even the seasoned divers seemed tense, their eyes darting as though expecting something to strike. Minutes into the descent, a flicker of movement caught my peripheral vision. My lamp wavered slightly as I turned to track it, and I felt that familiar prickle of dread along my spine. Something long and thin slipped past my tether, leaving a trail of darker water in its wake. My heart thumped loudly, echoing in the helmet. I could hear the others whispering over the comms, asking each other if they'd seen it too. The current shifted suddenly, pulling me sideways, and I realized I couldn't turn off the light, couldn't even blink without fear of losing sight of whatever stalked us. The trench floor was still hundreds of feet below when the first true anomaly appeared. I saw a faint outline, pale and contorted, hovering just beyond the range of my beam. Its head tilted unnaturally, tilting to follow the movement of my light. Every time my lamp moved, it followed, mimicking my motions like a predator studying prey. I gripped the tether and forced myself to breathe steadily. The water around me seemed to pulse with life, thick and resistant, as if warning me to keep moving, to keep the light on at all costs. Thomas, who had panicked on the previous dive, was ahead of me. He slowed suddenly, his lamp trembling. "I don't like this," he muttered, voice tight. "It's following us too closely. Maybe if we—" He stopped mid-sentence, as though the water swallowed his words. A shadow lunged from the darkness, moving impossibly fast. The beam of his light caught it for a split second, pale and gaping, and then it vanished into the black. I cursed under my breath, gripping my own light harder, realizing what Alvarez had meant. Turning off the lamp here would be like walking blind into a predator's mouth. We pressed on toward the trench floor, the pressure crushing and cold, but the lights carved a thin protective barrier around us. Every shadow seemed to circle, disappear, and reappear, making it impossible to predict where it would strike. My breathing was loud in my ears, echoing against the confines of my helmet. I glanced at the instruments. Everything read normal, yet the instinctual terror in my chest screamed otherwise. I remembered Alvarez's eyes the first day, the calm certainty that the ocean knew. If the light died now, the knowledge that we were visible but defenseless would be our undoing. Suddenly, I saw movement directly above us. Something glided against the current, moving faster than any natural creature should. I panicked for a fraction of a second, nearly twisting my lamp off to get a better look, and the terror hit immediately. The shape lunged toward Thomas's beam, snapping in and out of visibility like it fed on the darkness. My fingers clenched around my switch, unwilling to let the light die. I understood completely now. Never turning off your light was the only buffer between the living shadows and our fragile bodies. One flicker, one lapse in attention, and it would be over. The deeper we went, the heavier the water felt, almost as though it resisted our descent. My lamp illuminated jagged rock formations, broken ship debris, and pale, half-buried structures I could not identify. Every time I moved the beam, shadows shifted, reacting instantly. It was as if the trench itself were alive, reading our lights and adjusting its hunters accordingly. Thomas's breathing grew ragged beside me. I wanted to reassure him, but words felt weak against the silent, watching void. The rule had never felt so tangible, so brutally necessary. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed and the trench floor approached. I glimpsed something impossible, pale limbs extending from the darkness, grasping toward us, retreating when the light fell on them. The edges of the trench were no longer solid, they shimmered and writhed in response to our lamps. I whispered a silent apology to Alvarez for ever doubting his warning. We had survived Rule 1 by luck and careful attention. Rule 2 demanded constant vigilance. One misstep, one lapse in illumination, and the deep would claim us without hesitation. Then, without warning, my lamp flickered. A jolt of panic shot through me as the current seemed to tighten, pressing me downward. I tapped the switch furiously, and the beam steadied, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadows recoiled slightly, circling back to the edges, testing, waiting. I realized I had been holding my breath unconsciously. The simple act of keeping the light alive had become the thin margin between life and what lurked unseen. My hands shook, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or fatigue, but I knew I couldn't falter. The rest of the descent passed in tense silence, every creak of my suit, every murmur over the comms amplified by the oppressive void around us. We reached the trench floor, and the lamp's circle revealed broken metal, coral-like growths, and strange, unidentifiable shapes lying motionless. I kept the light moving in slow sweeps, conscious of the shadows circling just beyond the beam. I felt the weight of Alvarez's words settle over me. Ignoring the rules, even one as simple as keeping the light on, was to invite death from something patient, intelligent, and utterly unrelenting. At the edge of the trench floor, I glimpsed a figure rising from the darkness, pale, elongated, and unnervingly still. It moved against the current, approaching the circle of light. Its mouth moved, lips stretching wide without sound. My grip on the lamp tightened, refusing to blink, refusing to hesitate. I had broken Rule 1 before, but here, I understood the gravity of Rule 2. The light was our lifeline. Without it, the deep would swallow us, and I knew, in that moment, the ocean had already chosen what would happen if we faltered. The moment we reached the trench floor, the laminated sheet reminded me again. Rule 3, never speak to the shadows. I shivered, gripping my light tighter, as if speaking could somehow wake the figures lurking just beyond the beam. The previous rules had felt abstract at first, timing, illumination, but this one carried an immediate personal threat. I understood it now. Every shape that drifted in the darkness seemed aware, moving as though it could listen, comprehend, even respond. Words were a dangerous invitation. Silence was survival. The shadows had begun to take form, elongated, pale, and constantly shifting in the corner of my vision. I caught glimpses of long skeletal arms weaving through the water like smoke. Every time a diver murmured a word of reassurance, the shapes paused, tilting slightly, almost considering the sound. My stomach churned, remembering how small mistakes had already put us at risk. I forced my mouth to remain shut, even as the shadows seemed to circle closer, probing, waiting for a misstep that would allow them to strike. Thomas, beside me, hadn't learned restraint. He whispered to another diver about the pale face that had followed us, and instantly, the current shifted violently. Water slammed against our suits, and his light flickered uncontrollably. I grabbed his shoulder and hissed, "Don't speak, not a word." But he was frozen, eyes wide in terror, as a figure rose from the darkness, larger than anything we'd seen, and seemed to lean toward him. I realized then the rule wasn't metaphorical. Words had power here, and even a whisper could draw attention. The trench floor stretched ahead, littered with remnants of past dives and unidentifiable shapes. Every movement we made was watched, measured, and mirrored in ways I couldn't explain. I tried to focus on the instruments, on steady breathing, anything to keep my mind from drifting to panic. A faint shimmer caught my eye, and I swore the shadows were imitating our motions, as if learning, as if testing the boundaries of their patience. Speaking would be surrender. Silence was our only defense. Even silence felt precarious. I felt the water pressing against me, heavier than ever, as if the trench itself were listening. Thomas's breathing was erratic, each exhale a potential threat, and I had to remind myself to control my own. Every instinct screamed that speaking could be catastrophic, but the need to communicate, to reassure each other, was nearly irresistible. I clenched my jaw, refusing to answer the comms when another diver attempted a question. My hands shook with the effort, but the shadows didn't move closer this time. They watched, waiting. Hours passed, though time in the deep feels distorted. My light swept across the broken machinery, corroded beams, and jagged rock formations, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the unworldly figures hovering at the edges. One rose slowly, elongated and faceless, tilting toward us, as though curiosity had a form. I swallowed hard, thinking about Alvarez's warnings, and the importance of never speaking to the shadows. Each word, even a whisper of fear, could reach them and invite calamity. We had to move in absolute silence. The deeper we went, the more the trench seemed to react. Water currents twisted unpredictably, objects drifted unnaturally, and every shadow stretched and shifted in response to our lights. I realized then that speaking might not just draw attention, it could provoke them. Every word could trigger aggression. I remembered the pale faces from the previous dive, their silent mouths stretching unnaturally, lips moving without sound. Were they reading our intentions? Our fear? The thought made my skin crawl, and I kept my eyes firmly on the trench floor ahead. At one point, a shadow darted too close to Thomas, brushing the edge of his lamp. He froze, and I had to drag his hand from his mouth, suppressing a scream. The water around us pulsed with tension, alive and aware. Even moving my fingers to adjust the lamp felt risky, like the shadows might notice. I whispered nothing, forced my breathing to remain measured, and felt my heart hammer as the trench seemed to close in. Rule 3 had become clear. Communication, no matter how small, was a lethal risk. Then it happened. Something larger than any previous figure rose from the darkness, its elongated form stretching impossibly toward the center of our group. Thomas's lamp flickered, and instinctively, I saw him opening his mouth. My hand shot out to clamp over his helmet's comm port, but a hiss of escaping air cut through the silence. The shadow froze mid-motion, tilting its faceless head in our direction, and the trench seemed to hold its breath. My grip on Thomas tightened. One word could have doomed us. We moved cautiously toward a jagged ridge, where past divers had left markers. Every step was deliberate, silent, calculated. Shadows continued to weave around us, but none approached while we maintained our quiet. It was as if Rule 3 had erected a fragile barrier, one that could collapse in a single slip. My mind raced with possibilities. What would happen if a shadow reached us? How intelligent were they? The very act of survival now depended on restraint, on obeying this one unbreakable instruction. Finally, at the far edge of the ridge, we paused to regroup. Thomas shivered violently beside me, but he didn't speak. The shadows lingered at the periphery, watching, waiting. I felt a pulse of relief as we maintained our silence. The trench floor calm only because we obeyed. The rule had proven its necessity in the most visceral way. One word could have invited a fate I didn't want to imagine. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The shadows were patient, and the deeper we went, the more they would test our discipline. The moment we navigated past the ridge, I unrolled the laminated sheet again. Rule 4. Never touch anything that wasn't yours. My hands itched despite the warning, drawn toward debris and objects littering the trench floor. Broken helmets, rusted tools, and fragments of past dives called out to me like sirens. The shadows circled closer, almost inspecting, and I realized that one wrong move could be enough for them to mark us. Every instinct screamed to leave everything untouched, but the curiosity gnawed at me relentlessly. The trench floor was littered with remnants of history, vessels lost to time and equipment whose owners would never return. My lamp illuminated a cracked helmet partially buried in silt, and I felt the urge to lift it, to see if anything remained inside. The water seemed to pulse around me, pressing my mind with invisible pressure. I remembered Alvarez's tone when he spoke of the rules. They weren't arbitrary, each one had a price. I forced my fingers to stay curled against my suit, reminding myself that touching could awaken more than just rust. Thomas, still pale from our earlier encounter, drifted toward a twisted metal railing. He paused, hovering over a mangled box of supplies left by another crew. I caught his eye and shook my head violently. "Do not touch it," I whispered, though quietly enough that it wouldn't carry through the water or alert the shadows. His fingers twitched toward it, curiosity battling fear, and I had to physically shove him away. The tension between our instincts and survival had never been more palpable. One careless move could shatter the fragile barrier, keeping the shadows at bay. The shadows had become bolder as we advanced. Pale shapes slid closer to our lights, observing silently, circling with unnatural patience. They didn't attack immediately, but their presence felt like a warning. I realized the rule applied not just to objects, but to attention. Any temptation to interact with the debris or artifacts would draw their focus directly to us. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I maneuvered carefully, ensuring my beam never lingered on anything for too long. The trench felt alive, almost sentient, punishing even the smallest lapse in discipline. We passed the remnants of a previous expedition, skeletons frozen in impossible positions, tools still clutched in bony fingers. My stomach churned as I remembered that these were warnings as much as remains. One diver had apparently tried to examine an object too closely, and the ocean had claimed him without hesitation. The thought of encountering that same fate tightened the muscles in my arms and legs. I repeated to myself that the only way to survive was to ignore every temptation, to move past the wreckage without touching, without examining, without curiosity. The trench narrowed, jagged walls pressing in, silt rising from the floor like dust in sunlight. I could feel the shadows pressing closer as we squeezed through, a tangible weight of unseen eyes. Thomas stifled a gasp, brushing his light over a pile of twisted metal, and I grabbed his arm to prevent any contact. My grip burned, but I refused to let go. Even the slightest contact with an object that wasn't ours could be catastrophic. I could already feel the tension radiating from the pale forms hovering just beyond the reach of light. Something unexpected caught my eye, a fragment of an old subhull protruding from the silt. It bore markings, faded letters, and rusted rivets. I resisted the urge to brush away the sediment, to peer inside. The shadows shifted subtly, closer now, as if sensing the temptation. My lamp quivered in my grip, despite my effort to hold it steady. Rule 4 wasn't just about caution, it was about respect, fear, and survival. Everything here belonged to the trench, and our hands were not allowed to claim it. The trench seemed to react with every step, every flick of the lamp. The shadows elongated, stretching like tendrils toward objects we ignored. One figure lingered over a rusted diving suit, hovering, inspecting, and I felt my heart rate spike. For a moment the water seemed still, suspended in anticipation. The realization hit me, touching an object would do more than alert the shadows. It would mark us, binding us to the ocean in a way no one could escape. My hands clenched into fists, refusing to reach, refusing to give them any reason. We finally reached a clearing, where silt settled in thick layers, obscuring what lay beneath. The shadows circled this area with heightened vigilance, as if guarding invisible treasures. The lamp revealed skeletal remains interspersed with debris from long-lost missions, yet we moved with care, touching nothing, acknowledging nothing. My chest tightened with fear and exertion. Rule 4 had proven itself immediately. Survival depended on restraint, not curiosity. A single slip could end everything we had endured so far. As we prepared to ascend, a shadow hovered longer than usual over a twisted anchor, pale limbs reaching almost an invitation. I felt a cold instinctual warning, "Don't touch." I forced my eyes forward, kept my light trained ahead, and moved with deliberate precision. Thomas's breathing was shallow, and I could see him trembling beside me, fighting the urge to reach out, to explore. I knew if either of us gave in, the trench would claim us in ways we could not imagine. The objects here were not ours, and touching them would mean surrender. We ascended slowly, the trench floor shrinking behind us. Even as we rose, my lamp illuminated fragments we had ignored, pale shadows hovering just beyond the circle of light. The water pressed against us differently now, almost aware, almost resentful. I shivered, recalling Alvarez's warning that everything here had a cost. Rule 4 was not arbitrary, it was a boundary between life and death. As we broke the trench floor and approached open water, I could feel the eyes of the unseen lingering, measuring, and I knew this rule would haunt every dive yet to come. As we prepared for another descent, my eyes fell on the laminated sheet, and I froze slightly at the 5th warning. Rule 5. Never lose your tether to the surface. The thought made my chest tighten instantly, recalling how close we had come to disaster in earlier dives. The tether wasn't just a line of rope or cable. It was our lifeline, a fragile connection to the world above. Losing it here in the shadow-haunted trench would be like stepping into the jaws of some unseen predator with no hope of escape. I gripped the rope instinctively, tracing its path from my suit to the surface, and prayed I would never test the rule. The descent began with the usual tension thick in the water. Currents had grown unpredictable, swirling like invisible hands trying to tug us sideways. Shadows lingered beyond the beams of our lamps, weaving in and out of visibility. Each flicker of movement reminded me of how tenuous our grip on life truly was. The tether was a constant reassurance, a slim lifeline holding us to the surface, and every second I saw it intact, I felt a fragile sense of safety amidst the oppressive darkness. Minutes in, the trench constricted again, jagged walls pressing like unseen fingers. I felt the tug of the current against my tether, and nearly flinched. One misstep, one sudden jerk, and the rope could snap, or worse, slip free from its anchor. The pale figure circled, silent and waiting, as if testing our adherence. I realized then that Rule 5 wasn't about mechanics or protocol, it was about survival instinct. Those who had lost their tether were never recovered. Every fiber of my being screamed to cling tighter, to avoid even the smallest slack. Thomas drifted beside me, hands close to his tether, eyes wide as he whispered to himself, almost praying. I resisted the urge to correct him out loud, knowing any sound could draw the shadows closer. The trench seemed alive, reacting to our movements, tugging subtly at lines and ropes, as if it could sense hesitation or carelessness. I felt the ocean pressing from all sides, a living entity testing our limits. Losing contact with the surface here wasn't just a mistake, it would be the beginning of the end. Suddenly a shadow brushed past my tether, a thin, elongated figure that coiled like smoke. I froze, gripping the rope with white-knuckled intensity. The tug was subtle at first, almost playful, but I knew it wasn't coincidence. The shadow pulled at the line deliberately, testing me. I swallowed hard, forcing calm as the lamp illuminated the endless black around me. Alvarez's warning echoed in my mind, never lose the line. One slip, 1 second of inattention, and there would be no returning, no rescue. As we descended deeper, the water seemed to thicken, pressing down with a force that made each movement deliberate and exhausting. Every twist of the tether under my gloves became a lifeline I couldn't release for a moment. I kept my eyes on it, tracing the rope upward, measuring every inch, knowing that even a glance away could mean disaster. Shadows drifted in the periphery, patient predators waiting for the first mistake, circling closer whenever the tether slackened even slightly. A sudden current swept through, and I felt the line jerk in my hands. My heart hammered as I corrected instantly, keeping it taut, unwilling to risk even a hair's breadth of slack. Thomas cursed under his breath, and I gripped his arm, steadying him. The shadows paused, hovering just beyond the lamps, seemingly aware of the danger they could create. My entire body tensed, as I realized this rule wasn't just for our physical safety, it was a psychological test. a measure of our fear and discipline against the unknown. The trench floor was littered with debris, each piece of wreckage threatening to snag or sever our lines. I maneuvered carefully, light illuminating only the immediate surroundings, and felt the rope hum faintly under strain. One wrong turn could mean it wrapped around a jagged edge, leaving us dangling without support. The shadows reacted instantly, stretching toward the vibrating line as if it were a thread connecting prey to the surface. I clenched my jaw, refusing to let fear make me twitch or falter. As we reached the far edge of the floor, a massive shadow rose from the darkness below, pale, faceless, stretching impossibly toward us. The tether thrummed like a heartbeat, a tenuous link keeping death at bay. I forced myself to focus on the lamp, on the rope, and on every careful movement we made. Thomas's eyes were wide, reflecting panic, and I had to guide him by touch alone, keeping his hands on the tether. 1 second of letting go, and I knew, without a doubt, the trench would claim him. Finally, we began our slow ascent, tether taut and secure, the shadows trailing just behind, never letting the rope slack for a single moment. My muscles ached from the strain of constant vigilance. The deep seemed to watch every motion, aware of our dependence on this lifeline. Rule 5 had proven its brutal necessity. Survival in this abyss demanded we never, not once, abandon the connection to the surface. One slip could unravel everything, and the trench would not forgive. I stared at the laminated sheet again, dread curling in my stomach at the 6th warning. Rule 6, never swim ahead of the team. The thought was simple, almost mundane. Yet I knew now how lethal it could be. In the trench, moving faster than the others didn't just risk separation, it made you pray. Shadows waited, silent and patient, following any divergence, testing the line of sight, the safety bubble created by the group. Even a few feet ahead could mean encountering horrors alone, with nothing but darkness pressing in from all sides. The current had picked up, brushing against our suits, tugging subtly at our tethered lifelines. I glanced back at Tomas and the others, ensuring our lights formed a steady chain, each circle overlapping the next. The trench felt alive, aware of any imbalance, and every shadow seemed to respond to our cohesion. I could feel the pull of instinct, the temptation to surge ahead and explore, but Alvarez's warnings rang clearly. Never swim ahead. 1 step alone, and you vanished from safety. Minutes in, we navigated a narrow corridor of jagged rock, the walls slick and close. Shadows moved along the edges, flickering between visibility and nothingness. My pulse quickened as I realized how easily one diver could be isolated. A figure drifted closer than usual, and the water around it rippled unnaturally. I forced myself to stay with the group, watching Tomas's light trail as if my life depended on it, because it did. The trench punished those who ignored the invisible rule, testing patience and adherence. The pressure increased with depth, and fatigue set in, tugging at our resolve. My arms burned from holding the lamp steady, and I could feel the tension in every diver beside me. A sudden shadow darted toward the lead, swaying with fluid motion, almost hurting us in place. I clenched my fists, forcing my mind to focus on alignment, movement, and timing. The rule was not just about keeping together, it was about survival strategy. Alone, even for a moment, and the deep would strike with merciless precision. Tomas gasped suddenly, drifting slightly ahead in a reflexive panic. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back, ignoring his whispered protests. The shadows responded immediately, circling tighter where he had ventured. I felt the trench react to the slightest breach in our formation, as if it had a memory, an awareness of every lapse. Rule 6 wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifeline, a boundary that separated the living from those already claimed by the darkness. The trench floor opened into a cavernous expanse, the jagged walls fading into a pale haze of silt and debris. Shadows hung at the edges, stretching impossibly, some seeming to move independently of any current. I felt my heartbeat hammer as I watched Tomas adjust his position, momentarily out of line. The pale shapes twisted in response, gliding closer, almost to test whether the isolated diver would panic. My grip on the tether and lamp tightened. I whispered silently to him, "Stay with me. Stay with us." The ocean itself seemed to echo the warning. We navigated through wreckage, broken beams, shattered hull fragments, and remnants of past dives. Every piece of debris could snag a tether or obstruct movement, making the rule more vital than ever. One diver ahead would be invisible to the team's collective lights, exposed to unseen predators circling the darkness. I could feel the pull of the shadows, teasing, probing, but as long as we stayed together, we were protected, at least partially. The rule demanded absolute discipline, and one mistake here would be fatal. A massive shadow rose beneath us, pale and elongated, drifting just outside the circle of light. Its movements were deliberate, calculated, as if measuring our adherence. I could feel the water thickening around it, a pressure that wasn't just physical, but psychological. I glanced at the team. Tomas's breathing was shallow, and he kept his light aligned with ours. The trench seemed to respond to cohesion, rewarding those who moved together and punishing those who broke formation. Rule 6 was brutally clear. Separation invited death. The currents shifted violently, pushing against the tether and our bodies in unpredictable ways. A diver nearly surged ahead to compensate, instinct overriding caution, and I grabbed him, forcing him back in line. The shadows reacted instantly, coiling and darting in the direction of the misstep. I felt a cold, unnerving awareness in the water, like eyes watching our alignment, testing our discipline. The rule wasn't arbitrary. The trench demanded obedience, and disobedience could mean immediate consumption. Hours passed in tense silence, each diver aware of the others, every flicker of light a reminder of the fragile safety we maintained. I traced each lamp carefully, ensuring the chain was unbroken, willing myself not to glance ahead. The shadows shifted and moved with us, patient, calculating, aware. The trench seemed to pulse with anticipation, testing for any breach. I realized fully that never swimming ahead of the team wasn't just a guideline, it was survival encoded into the rules of this underwater abyss. As we reached another section of jagged ridges, a massive shadow lunged past the periphery of our lights, moving with fluid, predatory grace. I held my breath and felt the weight of Rule 6 settle over us. One wrong move, one surge ahead, and the shadow would strike, dragging a lone diver into the depths. I squeezed my lamp tighter, keeping it trained on the edge, feeling the tension ripple through the water like a warning. The trench had tested us again, proving the necessity of obedience, and I knew the challenges ahead would only grow more relentless. I glanced at the laminated sheet again, my pulse hammering as I read, Rule 7, never lose sight of the diver behind you. The previous rules had been warnings of timing, light, and group cohesion, but this one felt personal, intimate, almost sinister. In the trench, losing track of even a single diver could be fatal. Shadows waited patiently for moments of weakness, and the slightest separation would make any diver vulnerable. I forced myself to scan backward constantly, eyes darting to ensure no one had fallen behind. No one was invisible to the protective chain of light. The trench had narrowed once more, walls pressing close, silt rising like smoke with every movement. I could feel the weight of the shadows, hovering at the edges, testing every step. Tomas ahead seemed to sense my gaze, occasionally flicking his lamp backward to check the line. The movement reassured me, but it also reminded me that one misstep, one lapse in attention, could leave someone isolated, and the shadows would know immediately. Rule 7 wasn't just precaution, it was life itself. The water pressure intensified as we progressed deeper, tugging at our suits and making every movement deliberate. One of the divers wavered slightly, and I saw the shadows respond, circling the edge of the light like predators honing in. My heart raced as I adjusted my position, keeping my lamp aimed backward, ensuring no one was lost to the darkness. The trench seemed alive, attuned to our vigilance, ready to exploit even the smallest separation. I realized the rule demanded more than awareness. It demanded constant, exhausting vigilance. Thomas shifted again, his breathing tight, eyes darting nervously behind him. I felt the pull of instinct, the temptation to focus forward, to fixate on the trench floor and avoid the creeping dread behind. But Alvarez's words echoed. The deep remembers. Those who lost sight of companions were often the first to vanish, dragged silently into the darkness before anyone could react. I gripped my lamp tighter, heart hammering, refusing to allow distraction or fatigue to compromise our safety. The shadows seemed aware of our backward glances, almost mocking our diligence. Pale shapes slid along the trench walls, coiling and stretching with impossible fluidity. One figure lingered just outside the beam of my lamp, tilting its faceless head as if studying our discipline. Every inch of progress required careful navigation, each diver conscious of maintaining line of sight. I whispered silently to Thomas, a reminder to never lag, to never allow the light to fall between us. The trench had rules, and breaking this one would be fatal. As we approached a section of jagged metal debris, the water seemed to thicken unnaturally. Shadows darted closer, testing reactions, gauging whether any of us might falter. I felt the tug of panic in Thomas, and immediately adjusted my path to keep his light in view. The trench responded to every misalignment, every hesitation. Rule 7 wasn't merely about awareness. It was about survival instinct, training and discipline combined. The shadows could wait forever for someone to slip. A sudden surge of current nearly pushed one diver off alignment. I lunged instinctively, grabbing his arm and pulling him back into the circle of light. The shadows recoiled slightly, but remained close, circling and observing. The subtle thrill of terror mixed with adrenaline, making every moment feel stretched. I understood now why Alvarez had emphasized this rule. Losing sight of even one diver made them invisible to us, yet completely visible to the horrors around us. The trench floor opened briefly, revealing jagged ruins and fragments of long-lost expeditions. Every diver's lamp scanned the environment carefully, but I remained fixated on backward glances. Pale shapes slid over the terrain, coiling along edges, stretching into impossible angles. Each flicker of movement threatened to isolate a diver, and I clenched my jaw, refusing to let any eye leave my fellow crew. The shadows tested us continuously, probing for gaps in vigilance, rewarding discipline and punishing oversight. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in tense coordination. My shoulders burned from holding the lamp steady, scanning constantly behind, ensuring the chain remained unbroken. Shadows flitted just beyond the beam, aware, calculating, patient. One lapse, even momentary, would have been enough. I reminded myself repeatedly, never lose sight of the diver behind you. It was simple, brutal, and absolute. The trench had its own measure of time, patience, and observation, and I would not give it an opening. Finally, we reached a slightly wider section, where the current slackened. I allowed myself a brief exhale of relief, while still monitoring every light behind me. The shadows lingered, coiling at the periphery, testing, watching, waiting. I understood fully now that this rule was as much about fear control as survival. One person lost, one diver separated, and the trench would claim them in ways none of us could survive. Even at this depth, I felt the unspoken promise of Alvarez's words: obey, or pay the ultimate price. The laminated sheet trembled slightly in my hands as I read aloud, though only to myself, Rule 8. Never remove your helmet below the surface. The words felt heavy, suffocating, even before I descended, because I knew the depths would not forgive mistakes. The trench water was alive with unseen pressure and intent, and removing the helmet meant stepping into vulnerability that the ocean could exploit in an instant. I remembered Alvarez's eyes, wide and serious, the day he told me, "The deep doesn't care about your courage, it only notices weakness." That lesson was about to be tested in ways I hadn't imagined. The descent began with the usual careful movements, every muscle tensed, every light scanning. Shadows lingered at the periphery, pale and fluid, circling the team like predators aware of our fragile existence. The helmet was our lifeline, a personal boundary between survival and being claimed by the dark abyss. My fingers itched to adjust the seals, to feel the water directly, but the rule forbade it. Even a moment of curiosity, a tiny breach, could have irreversible consequences. I gripped the laminated sheet in my other hand, as though it were armor. Minutes passed, the trench walls narrowing again, as we approached a particularly jagged section littered with wreckage. The shadows seemed to respond to every micro-movement, curling and stretching, as if testing each diver's adherence. Thomas shivered beside me, adjusting his lamp nervously, and I knew the temptation to glimpse the trench without our helmets would be near overwhelming. Every time a diver's head tilted or light wavered, the shadows seemed to stretch in anticipation, waiting to see if the rule would be broken. The pressure of the water pressed in, thick and unyielding, making every movement deliberate and exhausting. My helmet felt heavier than usual, my breath echoing in its confined space. I was hyper-aware of every sound, the creak of my suit, the thrum of the tether, the faint sibilant whispers of the trench itself. The shadows were patient, but perceptive, drawn to any lapse. I clenched my jaw, refusing to even imagine removing the helmet, knowing that it would invite the abyss to claim me in ways no one could intervene. As we moved deeper, a shadow brushed just beyond the edge of the light beam, elongated and spectral, coiling like smoke over jagged debris. The shape paused, almost measuring, and I could feel its awareness of our vulnerabilities. The helmet was more than protection. It was a shield against curiosity and death alike. A single moment of exposure could provide the abyss with everything it needed. I tightened the seals mentally, imagining the horrors that awaited those who dared to breach this simple, brutal rule. The trench floor widened slightly, revealing jagged rocks and twisted wreckage from dives long forgotten. Shadows lingered at the edges, probing, circling, watching. Every movement of our lights was mirrored and studied, and I could sense their intelligence, their patience. I reminded myself repeatedly of the rule: never remove the helmet. Not a crack, not a tilt, not even a gesture. The trench did not distinguish between intent and error. Any exposure was an invitation. My breath felt shallow, heart hammering, as the team moved carefully through the terrain. Thomas reached toward a jagged edge to steady himself, and I grabbed his arm sharply, shaking my head. He glanced at me, eyes wide, comprehension dawning. I could see his internal struggle, the urge to remove the helmet, even for a fraction of a second, to feel the water directly. The shadows reacted instantly, coiling closer as if sensing hesitation. My grip on the tether tightened, and I whispered silently, "Do not even think about it." The trench seemed to pulse, a living reminder that Rule 8 was not a suggestion. It was survival encoded in law. Minutes blurred into what felt like hours, as we navigated through a narrow corridor of silt and jagged debris. Shadows flickered along the walls, some pale and human-like, others impossibly elongated and fluid. I kept my lamp moving in slow sweeps, careful to illuminate just enough for safety, but never enough to provoke the shadows. My helmet felt suffocating yet essential, a constant reminder of how fragile we were. Removing it would be like giving the deep an invitation, a key to exploit our weakness. Every diver moved cautiously, understanding that one lapse could spell disaster. A massive shadow rose from below, its limbs coiling like smoke in the faint light. It hovered for a moment, faceless and silent, tilting toward the lead diver, as if calculating intent. My fingers tightened on the tether and lamp, knowing that any sign of curiosity or exposure would mark us for its attention. The rule was clear: the helmet was not just equipment, it was a boundary between life and being claimed by the darkness. I swallowed hard, willing myself not to think about the suffocating pressure, not to imagine the water directly against my face. We pressed onward, the trench floor littered with remnants of past dives, tools, and skeletal remains frozen in the sediment. Every shadow, Every flicker of movement seemed to respond to our adherence, testing for cracks and discipline. My light swept across the debris, but I did not linger, did not allow my curiosity to dictate motion. I could feel the weight of the abyss pressing against the helmet, the suffocating reality of Rule 8 pressing down. One moment of weakness could undo everything, and I refused to give in. The deeper we descended, the more the water seemed to thicken, oppressive and aware. Shadows extended, brushing along wreckage, probing the edges of our circle of light. I held my lamp steady, scanning constantly, my helmet secure, breathing measured, refusing to give the deep any opportunity. Thomas mirrored my vigilance, eyes wide, hands gripping his tether and lamp with tension. Rule 8 was absolute, and we moved as if our lives depended on it, because they did. Suddenly the current shifted violently, sweeping debris and shadows alike. My lamp flickered, illuminating a massive pale shape, hovering just outside our circle. I felt the pull of instinct, the desire to glance, to see, to breathe freely, but I resisted. My helmet stayed on, my breath measured, hands gripping tether and lamp. I realized fully now that breaking Rule 8 was not just a minor misstep. It was a declaration of vulnerability to an intelligence beyond comprehension. The deep would not forgive curiosity. Hours passed in a tense blur of light and shadow, each moment reinforcing the lesson. The trench seemed alive, reacting to our discipline, measuring our adherence. One slight tilt of a helmet, one moment of exposure, and the shadows would know. I tightened my jaw, refusing to falter, forcing my mind onto the task of movement, survival and vigilance. Rule 8 was brutal, absolute, and yet, like all the others, it was our only barrier between life and the darkness that waited silently beneath. As we finally approached a slightly wider expanse, the shadows coiled back into the periphery, patient but watchful. I allowed myself a small measure of relief, but it was thin, fragile. Every diver's helmet remained sealed, tethered, and illuminated, and we moved as one. Rule 8 had proven its necessity in the most immediate, terrifying ways. The trench had tested our discipline, and we had survived another lesson in fear and obedience, but I knew the next challenges would demand even more. The laminated sheet shook slightly in my wet hands as I read, the ink smudged by condensation. Rule 9, never follow strange lights. I felt a shiver run through me, recalling the faint flickers we'd seen along the edges of the trench. Lights that weren't ours, pale, pulsing, almost beckoning. Alvarez had warned me about these before, saying, "The deep has illusions, and not all light leads home." I knew this rule was more than guidance. It was a shield against curiosity that could lure even the most disciplined diver into oblivion. We pressed forward slowly, every diver's lamp moving like a deliberate heartbeat through the black water. Shadows lingered at the periphery, stretching and coiling, as if aware of every slight hesitation. I caught a pale shimmer in the distance, flickering in an irregular rhythm, and my stomach tightened. My instincts screamed to ignore it, to stay with the team, and yet the mind always wonders. Alvarez's words echoed in my memory, "Follow it, and you might never return." The lure was real, potent, and deadly. The trench twisted around jagged rocks and debris, narrowing and expanding unpredictably. Shadows responded to our lights, sliding along the walls with fluid, silent precision. I could feel the strange flicker from earlier drifting toward us, a faint glow that seemed to pulse in tune with our fear. I had to remind myself constantly to look away, to keep the beam steady on the floor, and my team never chasing something that didn't belong. Rule 9 was simple in phrasing, but terrifying in practice. Thomas glanced toward the flickering glow and hesitated, eyes wide. I grabbed his arm firmly, steering him back into alignment. "Do not follow it," I whispered under my breath, careful not to speak too loudly. The shadows responded instantly to any lapse, stretching closer, testing, observing. The flickering light pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat, almost taunting us. My own pulse quickened, but I forced calm, holding the tether, focusing on the team, ignoring the spectral lure that threatened to pull us into the unknown. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours, the current pushing unpredictably, swirling sediment and debris. I forced myself to concentrate on the lamps around me, counting each light, keeping the chain unbroken. The strange glow continued to hover in the distance, shifting slightly, pulsing unnaturally, like it had intent. Shadows moved in rhythm with it, circling, coiling, observing. Every fiber of my being screamed to look, to chase, to understand, but I refused. The deep demanded discipline, and Rule 9 was the guardrail between curiosity and death. As we navigated past broken machinery and jagged outcrops, the light flickered again, closer this time. My stomach turned, and I felt Thomas tense beside me, lamp shaking slightly in his gloved hands. I clutched his arm, guiding him with deliberate precision, forcing our eyes forward, never acknowledging the glow directly. The shadows reacted subtly, stretching toward the light, coiling closer as if feeding off our temptation. Rule 9 was more than a suggestion. It was a command to resist the deepest impulse of exploration and desire. A sudden ripple passed through the water, and I felt the current push harder, as though urging someone to chase the light. My breath hitched, fingers gripping the tether and lamp, refusing to move toward it. The pale shapes responded instantly to the hesitation, curling and stretching closer. The lamp's beam barely touched the edges of the spectral glow, and I felt the full weight of Alvarez's warning. Follow it, and you may vanish entirely. My heart pounded as I forced focus on the tether and team, the lamp trembling slightly in my grasp. The trench floor widened slightly, revealing jagged fragments of wreckage, rusted beams, and scattered tools. The strange light hovered beyond, impossible to ignore, yet I refused to divert even a fraction of our path toward it. The shadows moved deliberately, circling our formation, coiling and stretching, testing our adherence. Thomas mirrored my vigilance, hands gripping tether and lamp with intensity. Rule 9 was simple in wording, but survival demanded we embody its discipline completely, resisting the spectral temptation the deep laid before us. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours, as the strange glow flickered intermittently, hovering just outside the periphery of our lights. Every shadow seemed to respond in unison, reacting to every glance, every moment of hesitation. I forced my eyes forward, counting every lamp, making sure no diver had broken alignment, ensuring no one had even thought of chasing the light. Rule 9 wasn't just survival, it was a psychological test, a measure of our fear and control under pressure. Finally, the glow dimmed slightly, receding into the blackness, though I knew it hadn't vanished entirely. The shadows lingered, still observing, still coiling just beyond our circle of light. I exhaled slowly, muscles tense, and reminded myself of the lesson. Never follow strange lights. Even those that seemed harmless, almost inviting, were traps set by the abyss. The trench had proven again that obedience was life, and curiosity could be death. Yet I knew more trials awaited, more rules yet to be tested, each darker and more relentless than the last. I traced the laminated sheet under my gloves, and read with a shiver, Rule 10, never speak below the surface. The warning felt immediate, suffocating, because I could already sense how fragile our control was. The trench listened. It remembered, and every word, every sound, was a signal to the shadows lurking in the corners of darkness. Alvarez had stressed this countless times, his leathery face grim. The deep doesn't hear as we do. It interprets, and sound is a beacon. I forced myself to swallow my words, even whispers, as we descended further into the oppressive black. The water pressed around us, cold and unyielding, shadows curling along every surface. Observing, Tomas's lamp flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shapes that seemed almost sentient. Every motion was deliberate, every breath was measured. I could feel my throat tighten as I resisted the urge to speak, to comment on the flickering shapes, to utter a word of fear. The trench was listening, testing, counting our disobedience. Rule 10 was a subtle but lethal trap. One careless sound, and the shadows would respond immediately. Minutes dragged as we navigated narrow corridors littered with jagged debris. Shadows shifted along the walls and the floor, circling, coiling, and probing. I felt the pressure of the trench in every fiber of my body, a psychic weight pressing on my mind. Tomas had glanced at me, mouth moving silently, perhaps to ask a question, and I caught his eye, shaking my head violently. Not a sound. Rule 10 wasn't just a recommendation, it was survival. The shadows were patient, yes, but infinitely observant, and they would exploit even the slightest vocalization. A pale figure appeared briefly beyond the light's edge, curling impossibly, limbs extending into angles that defied logic. I held my breath, lamp steady, counting the seconds, refusing even the subtlest exhale that might disturb the water. Every movement of the team was measured, silent, deliberate. The trench seemed to respond, a living organism, reacting to sound as if it had intent. One careless murmur, and the shadows would descend with lethal precision. I clenched the tether, forcing calm, willing Tomas and the others to maintain absolute silence. The trench narrowed again, debris scraping against our suits, currents tugging unpredictably. I felt the water thicken, press, and pulse, as if listening to the faint vibrations of our presence. A diver ahead almost spoke, perhaps an instinctive warning, and I grabbed his arm instantly, holding him close. He froze, eyes wide, and I forced my own heart to slow. Rule 10 was not about discipline alone, it was about survival, a rule that separated the living from the claimed. One word could draw attention from depths we could not imagine. We moved past twisted remnants of past dives, rusted hulls, broken beams, and skeletal remains frozen in silt. Shadows hovered at the edges of the lamps, stretching, coiling, testing the integrity of our silence. I could feel the trench's awareness, almost like a presence that listened, judged, and waited. Any sound might invite disaster, and I forced every breath into the slow rhythm of the regulator, refusing even a whisper. Rule 10 had proven itself again and again in my mind. The silence was our shield, our lifeline against unseen predators. A sudden current swept through, stirring silt and debris, creating a murky haze. I felt the pale shapes move more boldly, coiling closer, almost curious. My lamp quivered slightly, and I forced my hands to steady it, clenching the tether tightly. Every instinct urged me to speak, to warn, to comment, but I resisted. The shadows responded instantly, to even the subtlest hint of sound. My lungs burned as I moved, careful, deliberate, knowing that Rule 10 was absolute. A single word could cost us everything. The trench opened into a slightly wider chamber, filled with jagged rock formations and twisted remnants of past divers. Shadows coiled along the edges, undulating in rhythm, with unseen currents, stretching impossibly toward the team. I moved slowly, lamp sweeping across the floor, tether taut, and focused on keeping every diver within sight, and every breath controlled. The silence was suffocating, but obeying Rule 10 was the only way to survive. Any lapse would make us audible in ways the deep would exploit. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in near total silence, each diver hyper-aware of the other. The shadows, the currents, the lamp beams created a fragile circle of light, but beyond it, the trench seemed alive, listening, waiting for a mistake. I swallowed repeatedly, focusing on every movement, every tether, every sweep of the lamp, refusing even an internal murmur aloud. The shadows observed, patient, calculating, always responding to the slightest infraction. Rule 10 was lethal in its simplicity. Never speak below the surface. As we approached another narrow corridor, a massive shadow rose from below, pale, elongated, faceless, stretching impossibly. The trench seemed to pulse with anticipation, as though it had felt every word we had withheld, gauging our discipline. I felt the full weight of Rule 10 pressing against my chest, a psychological as well as physical tension. The shadows hovered, testing, waiting, and I forced my body to move with deliberate precision, breathing silent, heart hammering. Obedience to this rule meant life. A single word could undo everything. Finally, we reached a slightly more open section, but the tension remained, thick and unyielding. Shadows coiled at the edges, still observing, still testing, stretching just beyond the lamp beams. Every diver maintained silence, lamps steady, tethers taut. Rule 10 had proven itself with terrifying clarity. The deep listened, remembered, and punished without hesitation. I knew the final rule, Rule 11, awaited us beyond this stretch, more harrowing than any yet, and the shadows seemed to anticipate our next trial. I traced my gloved hand over the laminated sheet one last time, dread knotting in my stomach. Rule 11. Never look back at what follows. Alvarez's words echoed in my mind as we descended into the inky black. Some things follow you, and if you see them, you belong to them. The trench seemed to pulse around me, alive and patient, the shadows stretching farther than before, coiling just beyond the reach of the lamps. Every instinct screamed to glance backward, to check the dark trailing us. But I knew better. Survival demanded obedience, and this final rule was the ultimate test of discipline. The water pressed heavier as we moved, currents tangling with our tethers like invisible hands. Every diver held rigid, lamps aligned, eyes forward, breaths measured. Shadows shifted along the walls and floor, coiling and undulating in patterns almost intelligent. I could sense them waiting, circling just behind, testing the strength of our nerves. The deep's patience was infinite, but our window to move unscathed was finite. I forced my thoughts ahead, ignoring the instinct to twist my head, knowing even a fraction of hesitation could be fatal. The trench narrowed suddenly, jagged rocks scraping against our suits as the shadows became more fluid, more aggressive in their presence. I felt the pull of curiosity, the primal need to look, to verify, to confirm what lurked behind us. Every flicker of movement in the corner of my vision demanded attention, but I resisted. Rule 11 was not about restraint. It was about survival against the incomprehensible. I clenched my lamp tighter, focusing on the beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, tethered taut. Every diver's light, a fragile shield against the unknown. Thomas's breathing quickened beside me, a reminder that even discipline wavered under fear. I glanced at him momentarily, then forced my eyes forward. The shadows shifted instantly in response, stretching closer to the edge of the lamps, testing boundaries. The trench seemed to be aware of every microsecond of hesitation, every thought of looking back. One glance, even unconscious, could invite the deep to claim what it had been silently following. Alvarez's warnings felt immediate, alive, and the fear in my chest was visceral, not imagined. A sudden current swept debris past our lights, twisting it in erratic patterns, and for a split second, my eyes flicked backward, then I wrenched them forward violently. I felt the trench pulse, almost in response, and my heart pounded as if it had registered the lapse. Shadows recoiled slightly, then stretched again, relentless and patient. I reminded myself, never look back at what follows. The rule was simple in words but absolute in practice. Survival depended on fear management, obedience, and maintaining the forward-facing focus that separated us from whatever haunted the black. The trench floor widened into a cavernous expanse, skeletal remains of past divers and twisted wreckage scattered in every direction. Shadows moved fluidly along the edges, some reaching impossibly toward our circle of light, coiling, stretching, teasing. I felt the invisible weight of unseen eyes on our backs, testing our discipline, daring someone to turn. Every flicker of light, every twitch in the water, seemed amplified. The instinct to look back was primal, irresistible, and yet I forced myself to advance, tethered and vigilant, maintaining strict adherence to Rule 11. Minutes, or what felt like hours, dragged as we maneuvered past jagged debris, the shadows following at the periphery, patient, deliberate, almost sentient. Thomas kept pace, eyes forward, lips pressed tight, breath shallow. I felt every shadow's presence in the press of water against my suit, in the flicker of light across jagged edges. Rule 11 demanded more than fearlessness. It demanded total control over instinct, the ability to resist the urge to glimpse the unknown trailing us. The trench tested everything we had learned, building to a climax that felt eternal. A pale figure coiled from below, stretching impossibly, faceless and unyielding, reaching toward the back of our formation. My heart pounded as I forced myself not to turn, not to acknowledge its presence. The shadows reacted instantly to the slightest motion, coiling tighter, measuring, waiting. Every step, every deliberate stroke of the flippers was a battle between instinct and obedience. The trench seemed to breathe, alive with awareness, as if it could sense every thought about looking back. One moment of weakness and the rule would claim its victim. The deeper we descended, the pressure of the water pressing as though it were a solid wall, the shadows seemed to stretch farther, nearly infinite in their presence. I could feel the trench's intelligence in the subtle shifts of current, the gentle tug of water around my tether, as if it were guiding us to maintain vigilance. The fear was suffocating, a tangible entity pressing on every nerve. Rule 11 was not just guidance, it was a commandment of survival. Any breach, any glance backward, could mean immediate consumption by whatever followed silently. Finally, we reached a section where the trench opened, a cavern so vast that light barely penetrated the silt-filled water. Shadows lingered just outside the lamp beams, coiling, stretching, anticipating the slightest lapse. I felt the tug of instinct again, the pull to glance back, to see what lurked there. My grip on the tether and lamp tightened, breathing shallow, muscles rigid. Never look back at what follows was seared into my mind, my body, my very instinct. I understood now that this was the culmination of all the rules, the absolute test of obedience, fear, and discipline against the incomprehensible power of the deep. We moved as a single unit, every diver hyper-aware, lamps steady, tethers taut, forward only. Shadows lingered and pulsed in the periphery, patient and relentless. I could sense the eyes of the trench upon us, measuring, calculating, testing every microsecond of adherence. The water seemed to vibrate subtly, a reminder that the deep was alive, aware and waiting for mistakes. The final rule demanded perfection. One glance backward could undo everything, and I could feel, even in this wide cavern, that whatever followed was patient, eternal, and unforgiving. As we pressed onward, deeper into the abyss than any previous dive, the shadows stretched impossibly, coiling around wreckage, waiting just beyond the lamps. The trench seemed to thrum with an awareness that no human could comprehend, a slow, deliberate test of fear and discipline. My grip on the tether, my focus forward, every measured breath, all became acts of survival. Rule 11 had become more than instruction. It was life itself, the final boundary separating us from an unseen, relentless predator that followed without sound, without warning, and without end. And even as we advanced, I could feel it, the presence behind us, patient, ever moving, impossible to measure or confront. I refused to turn. My eyes stayed fixed ahead. The shadows waited, the trench listened, and I knew that obeying the rule was all that stood between the living and being claimed by the deep. The final lesson was terrifying in its simplicity. Forward alone was safety. Anything else invited oblivion. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that whatever followed would never stop, even if we survived this descent. We emerged from the trench hours later, exhausted, tethered, and still forward-facing. The rules had tested everything: discipline, fear, instinct, but the presence remained in memory, lingering in every shadow, every flicker of light in our minds. The abyss was patient, and it remembered those who disobeyed. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.